For some reason, oh, it's finally saying that we're live. Okay. It's taking a long time for some reason to.
As soon as you badmouth it, it's like, no, it's working.
Yeah, as soon as I start talking bad about you, it comes up, right?
Yeah.
So the the screen over here is not working. I'm not sure why. The other one has come on. So it says it's got power. It should be working, but it's not. So let's talk about a number of hypotheticals that were actually based on real cases. So if we look at the screen down there, there's a salesman who is fired right before a big commission is going to be paid out. The person who fires him is his manager, who ultimately gets paid the large commission. Ethical or unethical?
Depends on why he was fired.
Depends on why he was fired. So you need more facts than that. Let's suppose that he, did something wrong. He didn't follow policy and procedure, but he did land the commission, right? He did land the sale. Should he at least be paid the commission on the sale, or should his manager be paid the commission on the sale?
He should.
You think he should? All
He
right.
lands it. It's not the manager's. He wasn't the one who did it.
You take
Even
a
though
duck.
he might have broken protocol, but he still got the ultimate goal of landing the commission.
Okay. All right. What about mandatory urine analysis for all employees to check for nicotine?
That's company policy. If it is like if you want that job, that's probably in the contract stating that will happen.
So this was based on an insurance company that started the policy after the CEO decided that healthcare costs were rising. And one of the reasons that healthcare costs were rising was because of smokers. So he decided that he was going to start testing everybody. So they had already been employed and he changed the working conditions. Is that ethical? He gave them 6 months to quit smoking.
Then I would say yes. He gave them a leeway. He didn't just
Okay.
change it upon them immediately to catch people in the act. He gave them some time to get it together if they wanted to keep their jobs.
I'm going to take it you've never been a smoker.
No, sir.
I was a smoker for a long, everybody who went to law school became a smoker, right?
Never even seen it.
So it's harder than, 6 months sounds like a reasonable time period, but if you smoke, it is, I have quit twice in my life. I quit 25 years ago, and haven't smoked since, but it's really, really hard. It is really, it's not something that you can do, even in 6 months. Most people stop smoking and then they start again. Something stressful will happen and they will start again. What about this one? An employee is fired because she tells her coworkers that she's considering having an abortion. Now, this was until very recently legal in all 50 states, right? Under the doctrine of Roe versus Wade and this idea of privacy, it was perfectly legal. And at the time that this happened, it was perfectly legal, and the company fires her because she's considering having an abortion. They didn't fire her because she was actually having the abortion. They fired her because they said she created a ruckus when her fellow employees discovered that she was going to do this, and they started having religious objections to this employee's choice of action. And they fired her rather than the other employees that created the ruckus. What about that one? Again, abortion was legal at the time.
I would say unethical.
Okay, unethical. I would say tell your other employees to mind their own damn business or fire them.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
That would be my response. What about denying health benefits to an employee? Now, this was a much bigger deal in the 1980s. You all are too young to remember this, but I remember when HIV/AIDS first hit the scene. It was in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In the 1970s, they actually called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency syndrome, and they didn't know if it was contagious, if it was passed through the air, kind of like what we went through with COVID. We didn't know if you could get it from, touching something that somebody had touched. It was a very tenuous time. So they deny health insurance benefits to an employee who has HIV/AIDS because it was going to be really, really expensive to cover him, ethical or unethical. Nobody has an answer on that one. Generally speaking, insurance is a risk sharing benefit, right? I mean, the reason you get insurance is to share, to split the risk among people. Employee emails, this is the one in modern times that nobody has a problem with, because everybody understands when you go to work, they tell you your employee emails are, subject to us looking at them. It actually involves a very famous district attorney whose name was Harry Connick Sr. And you all may not know this, but his son is a very famous jazz musician and actor named Harry Connick Jr. from New Orleans. And Harry Connick Sr. was, for about 60 years, the district attorney of Orleans Parish. So in Louisiana, rather than counties, they have what are called parishes. And he was the district attorney of basically the greater New Orleans and surrounding area. And he had an employee who was saying things like, he's old and needs to retire. And she put this out on her public employee email, and they fired her. And the question was, did she have First Amendment rights, and were those protected by the United States Constitution? With regard to public employees of state or federal government institutions, you have First Amendment rights in your private and public life, right? That you don't have if you are employed by a private employer. Is perfectly free to say, we don't agree with your political, social, or economic philosophy and fire you, but public employees are covered by the First Amendment. And the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was a case called Connick versus Myers. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you have First Amendment rights, but it's a balancing test. And whether or not you create a huge disruption, it's not that we're looking at whether or not the content of your speech, but rather the impact that it had on other employees. Pre-employment psychological testing that includes the following questions. I believe there is only one true God. I wish I was not so consumed by questions or thoughts of sex. I believe that sexual relations between a man and a woman are the only normal and ordained type of relationships. I have never, and this is my favorite one in the psychological testing, I have never had difficulty starting, stopping, or holding my urine. Valid or invalid? That test is called the MMPI, and I have been told that it is a valid instrument. They're not looking for your answers on any particular question. They're looking to see whether or not you're consistent throughout, right, the answers that you give. Denying positions to female candidates that may be detrimental to them if they are pregnant. Now, this one is actually from a very famous Oklahoma case where Kerr McGee had a nuclear facility up by Guthrie, my adopted hometown, where I am the vice mayor. And if you worked in certain parts of that facility, if you were a female, you were denied jobs unless you would agree to be sterilized, because the impact of the nuclear fission material, if it was to have some kind of breach, could affect the fetus, right? And then they would be sued. But they would accept male candidates. Is that ethical or not? Most of us would say, like, increase your security, right? Increase your like level of protection of the employee, rather than denying women the right to work in various things. So work is something that's controlled by others. And when we talk about employee rights in the workplace, we can think of rights as being in a number of different senses. The first is we can talk about legal rights that employees have as a result of government intervention in the workplace. So if you went back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the 20th century, there were very few of these. And employees who were subjected to horrible working conditions in unsafe environments had very little rights. If they got their hand, finger, arm, leg, whatever, chopped off in these textile mills, for example, they were sent home with that day's wages, and that was it. And they oftentimes lived in company towns or company tenements, and they didn't have any right. And because they could no longer work, they were out, right? So as a result of that and the organization of labor, we got certain acts passed, like the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is administered by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Family Medical Leave Act, which protects people if they have to go out for an extended period of time to deal with serious health risk or a serious health condition of themselves or a close family member. ERISA is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, right? So we have these various legal rights that we have now imposed on companies as a result of many of the abuses that we saw in the early part of the 20th century. A second type of rights that we can talk about is contractual rights. What is it that I contract to do? So I, as a professor, have tenure, and that comes with a contract. And I am guaranteed a continuing contract every single year by the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges if I sort of perform my job, right? I don't abandon it, I don't leave, I show up and I talk to you all on Tuesday mornings at 9:30. I'm guaranteed these certain contractual rights, and it's very difficult to get rid of me. Most employees don't have formal contracts like college professors do, but they have sort of implied contracts where they go to work for a set wage, either hourly or salaried, and their employer agrees to provide them with certain benefits and things like that. And those are contractual rights. And then the biggest area that we're concerned with in this class is what we call moral rights. What are we entitled to as human beings in the workforce, given the fact that we are very vulnerable, right? One of the things that makes being a college professor unique is that basically the work is not terribly dangerous, right? I guess I could get carpal tunnel from typing up too many papers at my desk if I don't have the correct posture and the kinds of things that we need to avoid soft tissue injuries. But it's a fairly safe and secure job. Lots of other people have jobs that are not necessarily as safe and secure. They're working on road construction crews or production lines, or they're working in an environment that is extremely stressful. My brother is a tax attorney for Goldman Sachs, or was until he retired recently. That's an enormously stressful environment, and almost everybody that works there that he's a colleague with is on some form of anti-anxiety drug, right? As a result of the working conditions that go along with providing financial analysis, tax advice, and estate planning for these enormously wealthy individuals. So moral rights, what is it that we can expect as a human being from our employer from a moral perspective? That may not be legally enforceable, but we should try to engage in moral workplaces. Now, during the 1980s, one of the things that became fashionable was for companies to look around and say, look, we got all these old people around here, and we can hire people that are right out of college, particularly in banking and the financial industry. We can hire these people that are right out of college, and they'll do the job for cheaper, they'll do it faster, they don't have all of these health issues, they don't have kids yet, and so they'll work longer. If they're salaried, we can take advantage of that. Whereas these old people are taking off time, they're going to their kids' basketball games. And so it became sort of fashionable to have these reductions in force of these elderly people in the 1980s. That ultimately is illegal. It's covered under the act that prevents age discrimination, ADEA, Age Discrimination and Employment Act. But it's one of those things that's kind of hard to prove, right? And because nobody comes right out and says this on the record, they're not going to admit this when they get sued, right? That they did this. So you have to sort of prove it by indirect evidence in many instances in these cases, right? Under the ADEA. So they started doing this. One of the things that happened as a result of this was that company morale among employees and loyalty by employees started to decline. And companies started to recognize that, yeah, you can replace anybody. The question is, at what cost? So it's estimated that if you have a high producing individual, if you lose that individual, you're going to spend 1.5 times their annual salary in lost production and recruitment costs to get them back. So maybe we should think about that before we start just wholesale, like, letting people go in reductions of force. And those are the kinds of questions that we face in this class. So what kinds of moral rights? So when we think about this, one of the moral rights that we can think about is a right to work. And what does right to work mean? Again, there are numerous contexts that we can think about the right to work. One of the ways that we can think about right to work is right to work laws. Now, these became enormously popular, and they passed in most states, or in many states, including Oklahoma, overwhelmingly because it sounds good, right to work, right? What does it mean? Well, what right to work laws meant is that you don't have to join a union. If the union is representative of your workplace, you can't be forced to pay at least the union dues that cover the expense to engage in collective bargaining. Now, a lot of people say that's fine. Like I don't want to pay the union, and I have the right to do that, and this sounds good, but it creates what we call a free rider issue in economics. What is a free rider issue? Well, let's think about something outside of the workforce. There are lots of lobbying groups in the United States. Now, one of the things that George W. Bush said when he was president of the United States was that he was going to privatize Social Security, or at least privatize part of Social Security. And the idea was, I'm going to let you put your tax dollars aside in an investment fund rather than the government controlling it, and allow you to take the risk of that investment either growing or not, or sort of staying flat. The reason that never passed is because of a group called AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, right? They have lobbyists. Now, if I'm rapidly approaching the age that I can join the AARP. You have to be 55. I'm 51 to join the AARP. Now, why would I want to join the AARP? Knowing that they're going to go ahead and lobby to keep Social Security for me, why would I go ahead and join the AARP? Well, a lot of people don't, right? Because why would you spend this additional money every year when you know that the AARP is going to go ahead and lobby? So what does the AARP do to overcome the free rider issue? Well, there are lots of benefits that you get that you can't, that are exclusive to AARP members. For example, in travel and hotels, you get discounts on car rentals and hotel rooms if you're an AARP member that non-members don't get. So that's the way they attract people, to get them to pay dues into AARP so that they can continue to lobby on behalf of these people. Well, unions, what can they, a lot of them don't have this ability to give you free hotel rooms. Why is it that the AARP works with Marriott and Hilton and all of the major hotel chains, Avis, Budget, Enterprise, to provide car discounts? Well, because they have a huge population of people that they have lots of free time, right? They travel a lot and they are going to use these services. And so the AARP negotiates with these companies in order to offer these benefits. Well, unions don't necessarily have that same sort of leverage and can't provide the same sort of private goods that you would get. So you have this free rider issue that you have to overcome in places like Oklahoma if you're going to have a unionized shop, right? So that's one sense of right to work that we can talk about, are right to work laws. Now, again, they passed overwhelmingly in places like Oklahoma and Texas because it sounds good, right? Like you think it means that I have a right to a job. A second sense of right to work can mean that you have an actual right to be employed if you want to be employed. And this is going to sort of the Catholic social philosophy, the faith of the Holy See. And the current Holy Father has been very big on this, that we need to take care of the least among us. And if they want a job, we should provide that. Well, that raises questions of who should provide those jobs, right? If we say that people have a right to have a job, who should provide those jobs? Should it be the government, or should we force the private sector into employing more people by providing them with incentives through things like the tax code or through grants to provide private sector employment? Another sense of right to work can be the right to continued employment. Once you have the job that you're at, and one of the things that's nice, and one of the reasons that I wanted to be a college professor, was I went to lunch one day. I was the associate legal counsel here at UCO. I was in my early 20s at the time, and there used to be a group of us that went to lunch over at the Redbud Room in the University Center. The Redbud Room is no longer there. They've renamed it something else, and it's kind of a fast food place. But they actually had, when I started to work here, we actually had a faculty dining room that was separate from what students could go to. So we had this private room in the back of, I think it was actually at the time that it started, it was called the Oklahoma Room, and then it became the Redbud Room. And we actually had a faculty dining room. And then it became that they took away our faculty dining room and they made it into a faculty table. So we had this table that said, reserved for the faculty in the Redbud Room. It was a big round table, and there was a lot of us that went to lunch there every day. And I'll never forget, the president of the university at that time came in one day and he sat down. He said, "Can I join you all?" And everybody said yes. You're not going to deny the president the right to sit down at the lunch table. And he said, "I'm working on my convocation," which is the speech that he gives every fall semester to the start of the semester, right? The president, there's a big meeting of the faculty. We all go over to I don't know, some auditorium in the Nye University Center or one of the ballrooms, and the president usually gives a speech, right, at this event, which is sort of like a state of the institution address and a where are we going for the next 12 months, right? So he says, I'm working on this address, and I just wanted to sit down with you guys and ask you, what are we doing right? And everybody at the table, with very few exceptions, who were not tenured faculty members at the time, the tenured faculty members kind of didn't say anything, and the non-tenured faculty members said, oh, everything you're doing is great and it's wonderful and we love being here, and UCO is the best place to work and blah, blah, blah. Keep doing what you're doing, right? And then he said, well, what are we doing poorly that we could do better? And I will never forget one of my colleagues, his name was Russell Jones, and he is my hero. Russ went to work in the Air Force. He got a college degree paid for by going through Air Force ROTC, went into the Air Force, learned to fly airplanes. He flew heavies, not fighter jets. And he ultimately worked his way up to flying Air Force Two. So he flew Spiro T. Agnew, which was the last person that he flew before he retired from the Air Force. So Spiro T. Agnew was the vice president of the United States for Richard Nixon, and Spiro T. Agnew was forced to resign. It's kind of interesting because he was corrupt and he was taking bribes when he had been governor of a state, right? So Spiro T. Agnew resigns. He goes to federal prison, I believe, and that was the last person that Russ flew. And then, of course, ultimately Richard Nixon resigns in 1973, I believe, right after he'd been reelected because of the Watergate scandal. So Russ, works his way up. He becomes the captain of Air Force Two, which is the plane that flies the vice president around, and is part of the squadron that also flies the president around. So they fly lots of dignitaries. Technically, any plane that the president is on is Air Force One. Any helicopter that the president is on is Marine One, things like that, right? So Russ flew Air Force Two because he flew the vice president rather than the president around. And, this is an interesting guy to know. Russ retired from the military. He went back to OSU where he had gotten his first degree, and he gets his PhD in marketing and logistics. And he became a full faculty member here at UCO. He went through the ranks. He started out as an assistant professor and got promoted to associate professor and got tenure at that point in time, and then became a full professor. And so the president says, well, what can we do better? And Russ says, and I'll never forget this, he says, I'll tell you exactly what you could do better. And he starts a list, and it was like a list of 13 items that he thought that the president at the time had totally failed on. And then he ends this tirade with the president of, and every single thing you have done morally offends me, and I think you should resign. And he got up and walked out of the restaurant with that. And I thought, if you can tell your boss, right, the president of the institution, all of this stuff, that's the job I want to have, right? That's the job that I want to have. So I went back and I got my PhD, and I came back to UCO, and I went through the ranks, and I became a tenured full professor, right? So I have a right to expectation of continued employment, but most people don't, right? Most states, with very few exceptions, California, Puerto Rico, some of the more liberal states, you are an employee at will, which means that you can leave your employment at any time, and your employer can fire you for any reason but the wrong reason. Now, should they be able to do that? This becomes a really big question. Should employees or employers be able to just fire people at will? Well, most of the states and most people believe that if you're doing your job, you should have nothing to fear, right? This is sort of like the argument that students had when I taught criminal law and procedure. If you have nothing to fear from the police, you have no reason to not tell them that they can search your car or whatever. There's more to that than that. And I think we really have to think about these kinds of issues. So a more interesting question with regard to this idea of right to work is that once you have a job, should you have some expectation? And in other countries, by the way, we're the only country that has this philosophy. In every other country on earth, for the most part, once you get a job and you pass a probationary period, you have an expectation of continued employment with that company. This was very common when I was a foreign exchange student in Germany. The father of the family that I lived with, we decided that he was going to have a nervous breakdown, and he just decided he was going to go to the spa. And there was nothing his employer could do about that. Whereas in America, we'd be like, you're gone. If you exceed your FMLA, your history. But that's not the way most of the rest of the world works. And I think maybe we should consider those kinds of questions. So what would a continued expectation of employment look like in the workplace? Well, it would involve things like due process in the workplace. Now, what does due process mean? There's two types of due process. When we talk about due process rights, at a constitutional law level, there are two things that we look at, and it's one of the things that we should consider as employers. There is what we call procedural due process, PDP. Procedural due process versus substantive SDP. Now, what is procedural due process? Procedural due process is the idea that if we provide you with certain protections, those protections will probably ensure that you are treated fairly. What are these protections? Well, let's suppose that you're accused of doing something in your workplace, like, I don't know, using company time wastefully. This is called time theft, right? And every employee does this to some extent. We can't really literally sit there for 8 hours a day and think about XYZ, or, it's easier in mechanistic jobs to monitor this. So we used to have a GM plant here in Oklahoma City, and at that GM plant, they produced certain models of car, right? And people on the assembly line were literally responsible for bolting on certain numbers of tires every day, for example, or mounting engines, or spray painting bodies, right, of the car. And that's very easy to sort of quantify. When you get into intellectual jobs, like the job that I hold as college professor, it becomes harder. How do you measure whether or not I am producing what it is that I'm supposed to produce? Am I showing up, right, for one thing, to class and providing you with the material that you're supposed to have in order to go out in the world and be a productive sort of marketing professional, right? So that's hard to measure, right? Because how do we actually measure that? It's not just me. You're taking one class with me probably, and other classes with other professors. And how do we measure whether or not I have actually contributed to your overall betterment, right? That's sort of very, very ephemeral and something that is very, very tricky to pin down, right? So given the fact that it's very difficult to sort of objectively measure what it is I do, right? So as a college professor, I'm responsible for three things. I'm responsible for teaching. That's 50% of my job. I'm responsible for research. That's a big portion of my job. And then I'm responsible for service to the institution and the profession. So I'm supposed to engage in committee work and serving on outside boards that host conferences and things like that. It's service to the profession, right? How do you measure that? Well, it's a kind of subjective thing. My colleagues have to evaluate whether or not I've done these things sufficiently. And so they come in and they sit in my classroom from time to time and they evaluate whether or not they think that I am providing quality instruction. Am I using a variety of techniques to try and reach people, right? So let's suppose that I'm accused of something and they're trying to revoke my tenure. What is it that I'm gonna want to guarantee that I have a fair hearing or shot at keeping my job? Well, that's the area of procedural due process, right? What is that gonna entail? Well, it's gonna entail things like, well, I don't want the person who's accusing me to be the one that decides whether or not I keep my tenure, right? It should be somebody else. It should be some objective third party. If that person is the dean, it shouldn't be the dean, right? That's hearing my case. So what do we have? Well, we have what's called a faculty grievance committee that's made up usually of faculty members from other colleges. So they're disinterested in the outcome. They're probably not as likely to know me or to know the dean of the College of Business, right? They're supposed to be sort of more objective. They come from the College of Education, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Fine Arts and Design, the College of Math and Sciences, right? If one of their members is being denied or having tenure revoked, it won't be, for example, if they're in the College of Math and Science, it's not going to be people from Math and Science. It's going to be from people from the College of Business, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Fine Arts and Design, the College of Education, right? So that's sort of like one of the things that we want in terms of a procedure. If we think about this in terms of what you are guaranteed in terms of a trial, right? If you're accused of a crime, you are entitled to a jury of your peers. You're entitled to call witnesses on your behalf. So I should be able to call witnesses that say, yes, I went to Granted Gary's class and I listened in and he seemed to be talking about things that were relevant and timely to marketing. I should be able to question witnesses that are against me. So if it's, for example, the dean or my department head that's accusing me of something and trying to revoke my tenure, I should be able to cross-examine those witnesses, right? That's all part of procedural due process. And then I should know what the decision is, rather than it being sort of a secret. They should give me the decision in writing, in theory. And we have all of these things. Now, in reality, in the private sector, we don't have a lot of this, right? Usually, where can you go and you sort of have informal hearings and things like that? You go to HR in organizations that are large enough to have an HR department, and they sort of listen to you and they decide, you know, but it's far more limited than it is in the public sector. So the heart of due process, procedural due process, is in these environments, given the fact that organizations can't necessarily provide, the UCO provides a large range of procedures for tenured faculty. If you're not tenured, it's very, very short, right? And that's what most employees get. What is the heart of due process? Well, we're going to say it's notice, the right to be told what you're doing wrong, and a hearing. Notice and hearing is the heart of procedural due process. The right to be told what it is, you know, like we have given you 13 performance evaluations where we've told you, you need to file report X, for example, and you've done none of that, right? And then a hearing with someone from HR, right? Now, lots of companies, you know, they're small, mid-sized companies, they don't even provide this. Why is that? Well, because companies in the corporate world will argue that providing employees with these things, procedural due process, violates efficiency, right? It's not efficient. Universities are not necessarily efficient. That's not our goal. Our goal is to provide something that is very hard to measure. Now, the government, which funds us, has started saying you need to do that. You need to provide. So how do we do that? Well, one of the things that we do, and I'm very fortunate to be a marketer and to be involved in a sales program, because we can say that we have about 98% placement of our majors and minors once they graduate, and 80% of our majors and minors make over 6 figures in their first year. That's really impressive, right? Those are numbers that we can objectively identify as, and why is it? Well, because largely what we teach in the professional selling course is not classes like this that are highly theoretical, they're highly practical, right? They provide you with practical skills. Now, what I would argue is that this class, even though it's theoretical, provides you with ways of analyzing problems that are enormously important, right? So businesses will argue, look, providing people with substantive due process or procedural due process, is costly. It violates our property rights. We have a business, we own this, we have the right to our money, and you're violating that if you expect us to give us that. What would I say to that? And it's not efficient. It is not efficient, right? Democracy and due process are not efficient. The most efficient form of government is a dictatorship or an absolute monarchy. The king decides what is the law, and it is carried out today. I sign a decree saying this is the law, and it is executed today, right? That's efficient. Democracy is not efficient, right? Due process is not efficient. What would I say to that? What arguments could I make that this is something that we should seriously think about, right? Well, I think what I would say is that organizations that don't engage in these kinds of things, like workplace democracy, right, are organizations that don't have commitment from their employees. They are organizations that employees don't engage in what we call living the brand. What is an organization that exemplifies living the brand? Well, for a lot of years, it was Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines was one of the few airlines that had never gone bankrupt. Why is that? Because their employees lived the brand. They didn't pay the most of any airline, but people literally wanted to go to work for Southwest. Why? Because they believed that Southwest treated them fairly. They believed that Southwest listened to them, right? That it created an environment of self-respect. It decreased alienation among workers. If you view workers simply as cogs in a machine that are replaceable, workers feel that, right? Which increases alienation and burnout. Again, managers will argue that these kinds of things, workplace democracy, procedural due process, substantive due process, by the way, are rights that we think that we have as sort of basic human rights. The right to free speech, the right to self-autonomy, having bodily integrity, the right to determine for ourselves what we're going to do. A lot of these rights are embodied in the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, in particular, the First Amendment, which contains 5 substantive rights, right? Freedom of speech, press, religion, petition of government for redress of grievances, and assembly, right? Those are the 5 substantive rights found in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And people have these rights, and they are protected to some extent, even in the private sector. You cannot fire people because they don't believe in your religion unless you are a religious organization. Now, what is a religious organization? That becomes somewhat tenuous, but the vast majority of companies are not, right? There are some that are really on the fence, and the Supreme Court has sided with those companies wrongly, I think. Companies like Hobby Lobby, for example, Hobby Lobby, what do they say? We're a religiously based company. You're selling art supplies, right? What does that really have to do with religion? Obviously, I think if you're the Holy Roman Catholic Church, you have the right to say, like our religion says only men can be priests. Personally, do I think that that's correct? No, but that is the canonical interpretation of that faith. And so obviously they have the right to do that. And they are a religious institution, right? So they have greater leeway in these kinds of things. But generally speaking, some of these rights even apply in the private sector. We have, for example, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, prohibitions against discrimination on the basis of race, creed, color, religion, political affiliation, things like that, right? That you can't even violate, even if you are a private sector employer. Employee health and safety comes into this issue. This is largely regulated by the federal government on the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, and regulated by OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. What are the degrees, right? Obviously, some jobs are inherently risky. Being a coal miner, for example, is going to be subjecting you to an inherent risk of things like black lung. Privacy in the workplace is another big issue, particularly in the private sector. In the public sector, I have a greater expectation of privacy in my, for example, office. The university provides me with an office. I have a greater expectation of privacy. Do they have to get a search warrant to search the office? That's debatable, right? But I have more. In this day and age, electronic privacy, of course, your generation growing up in an electronic age recognizes that if your employer gives you email, that you're probably not going to have an expectation of privacy in the email. When I log on to D2L, it says there is no expectation of privacy in this platform. They can open it up to CC to look at the content of the course at any time, right? So those are things that we have to think about. Should we have more privacy in the workplace? This is all a balancing act between legal, contractual, and moral rights. Considering employee rights versus employee responsibilities. So what are employee responsibilities? If we say that you have rights, what are employee responsibilities? So rights are what we just finished talking about, are those things that are owed to us by other people, right? If you have a right to free speech, what do we have that we owe to other people? The government owes to us and other people owe to us, right? Well, if you believe in free speech, it means that you have to recognize that people who have speech that you might find abhorrent have a right to express that free speech, right? So, I have a right to free speech. It means that I also have to respect others' rights to disagree with my position and not do things like shut them down, deny them access, right? Responsibilities, on the other hand, are what we owe to other people, right? So for every right, there's generally a corresponding responsibility. As Americans, we have the right to vote in elections. What is the responsibility? The responsibility is that we actually exercise that right, and most people don't. In presidential elections, about 50% of the people that are eligible to vote go and vote, right? You have a responsibility. If you don't go and vote, if we lose, it's one of the reasons that places like Switzerland, which is a democratic country, fine you if you don't go vote. If you don't go vote in Switzerland, they will fine you. Why? Because if you don't vote, the democracy itself may fail. So we have a right to vote. We also have a responsibility to vote. I have a right to free speech as an American citizen. I have a responsibility to recognize that others also have that right, right? Even people who adamantly or horribly disagree with me, right, have that right to free speech.
That's super interesting that we're talking about that, because there's a whole debacle going on with like Disney and Rachel Zegler, who played Snow White. There was a whole issue about like, because some of the interviews that she was doing, she was very politically inclined in them, and she said a couple things that like morally probably shouldn't have, but then that also goes back to what we're talking about now. Like,
Right, so
she
like
has the
Disney
right
is
to-
Disney is actually famous for lots of companies. When I was a kid growing up, most companies refused to take political stands. They just didn't. Disney was one of the few that has. Like they have been enormously politically active, right? On a wide range of issues that are controversial, right? I mean, Disney is one of the first companies that came out in support of the LGBTQ community, right? And it has cost them, because there are groups that will not, they boycott Disney as a result of that stance. But Disney has said, basically, this is our fundamental, they stood up against Ron DeSantis, and it's cost them. Disney actually had a quasi-governmental status in Florida over their theme park. It was called the Reedy Creek Development District, and Disney controlled it. They own the fire department and the police departments and those, and they controlled it. And Ron DeSantis said, if you're going to do this, and we're going to take this status away from you, and he did. And he appointed his own people to the board of the Reedy Creek Development area, right? So it's not without costs, but yeah, Disney has been one of those that has been, sort of on the forefront of cutting edge. Now, they have been accused as a result of that of silencing other, if they have employees that have different views. Now, what I would sort of say is, if you don't believe in the values that Disney holds, why would you go to work someplace, right? It's sort of like somebody saying, well, I want to be a Catholic priest, but I don't believe in Jesus, right? That's sort of part of the fabric of what it is. It's not just sort of, it is the fabric of what it is to be a Catholic priest, is a belief in Christ as the Savior, right? I mean, but Disney's had lots of these examples of engaging in what they consider free speech, and it not necessarily always going over well with the general populace and their employees also engaging in free speech. That's one of the problems that you have when you're a content creator, right? And you hire artistic people. their expressions, you know, I mean, one of the biggest controversies right now, which artist is it? It's a country and western artist who, I think it's Jason Aldean, who sings a song called "Not in a Small Town," right? Like we're not going to tolerate X, Y, and Z in a small town, and it became very controversial because one of the places that he went and filmed, you know, to say like we're not going to put up with your liberal sort of stances in a small town, was a small town in the South that had engaged in massive amounts of racial segregation in the past. And he filmed in front of a church that had, you know, a history of controversy. I mean, it can be very tricky, right, to do this. So what are the narrow views of these responsibilities that we owe? Well, the narrow view is a principal agent view of employment, where the agent owes a duty of loyalty. Now, this is the most controversial of these ideas with regard to this narrow view. Obedience and thrift. Those two are not all that controversial. What is a duty of obedience? Well, if your employer says, I'm hiring you to mow my yard, right? So I'm hiring you to be my gardener. I'm hiring you to mow my yard. You're supposed to mow the yard. If you're not out there mowing the yard or trimming the trees, you're not doing your job. That's not terribly controversial. Duty of thrift. Well, what's the duty of thrift? Well, in my position, let's suppose that I'm a yard man for, you know, some wealthy individual. I take care of their gardens and blah, 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 blah. Well, I have a duty to treat the equipment appropriately, to not drop it, to not break it, to not, you know, go out. Let's suppose I'm mowing the English garden that has, you know, a centerpiece, which is a patch of grass that is, you know, like basically the size of this room. I shouldn't go get the backhoe out, right? To mow that, right? It's overkill. I'm not using the equipment and the resources in a thrifty way. The one that's controversial is a duty of loyalty. Again, if we went back to the 80s, when companies were sort of firing people because they looked around, they said, we got all these old guys around here, and you know, we can hire younger, faster, smarter people to do these jobs. Let's get rid of them. Loyalty implies that you are willing to make a sacrifice for someone else. That's what loyalty implies. That you are willing to sacrifice something for something else. And with regard to employers, if employers don't have a duty of loyalty to you, when my grandmother entered the workforce, well, okay, let me back up. My grandfather worked for the Manhattan Project. So he went to work for the Manhattan Project, and the first place that they were stationed was Oak Ridge. No, they first went to Ohio, then they went to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and then ultimately they were transferred with the Manhattan Project to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Sandia National Labs, which is where they developed, in Los Alamos, they developed the bomb, right? And at Sandia, I believe they developed the detonation device for the bomb. And these were tested. My grandfather was at the above ground testing of this device, which was in what's now known as the White Sands Missile Range at Stallion's Gate. He was at the above ground testing. So they transported the device down there. They put it on this big tower. You can go visit the site. It's kind of a creepy site to visit, where they detonated the first nuclear device in an above ground test at Stallion's Gate. You can visit it twice a year. It's open to the public. And one of the things that you can see is what's called Trinitite, because it was called the Trinity site. And they call it Trinitite, which is where literally the explosion melted the rocks around and the sand around to glass, to this glass product, right? So you can go visit this, you can see it. My grandfather dies of a massive heart attack at 36 years of age. And the president of the company, Sandia National Labs, went to my grandmother and he said, Tunny, the company will look out for you. We have a job for you. And they hired her to be the classified records librarian for the labs. So my grandmother classified nuclear secrets of the federal government, basically, for Sandia National Labs. And her job was to classify these records, to put them in order, and then to store them in these vaults in the Monsanto Mountains, which is a part of the Albuquerque area. That's loyalty on the part of the company, right? Most companies don't go to the widow and say, we're going to give you a job. Don't worry about your economic future because we're going to take care of you. That's what the company did for my grandparents. And my grandmother worked there until she retired. She retired at 55 years of age. She worked there over 20 years, got full, she had a pension. She was well taken care of, right, by the company. This idea of loyalty is very controversial because almost no company does that today. If your husband dies or you die, let's suppose it's a female employee on the Ford assembly line bolting tires to the Ford F-150, they're not going to go to the widow. They'll send flowers and they'll be nice and but they're not going to go to the widow and say, or the widower and say, we have a position for you, right? Unless you go and apply. I mean, like my grandmother did not have to apply for the job. They found her a job that she was capable of doing, and she did that job, right? The company took care of her. Companies don't do that anymore. So do you owe this duty of loyalty to an institution or an organization that doesn't have this idea of loyalty to you? Most ethical scholars would say you don't. Now, what are these tempered by? Well, professional ethics temper some of this, right? I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm always governed by the rules of professional responsibility. Those ethical codes are mandatory on me. In the learned professions, what are the learned professions? Well, historically, they've been theology, the law, and medicine. Those in that order. That was the order in which they sort of occurred as institutions of higher education formed out of largely the Catholic Church. And the first was to create a way of passing on knowledge to the clergy, and then there was canonical law that became associated with that. So the legal profession became the second oldest profession, and then medicine after that, right? So I am always tempered by the fact that I am a lawyer, right? So I have certain responsibilities that I have to engage in. Managerial responsibilities and conflicts of interest. Obviously, there's a difference in what you owe to the company depending on the position that you hold within it. If you're somebody who is on the assembly line bolting tires to the Ford F-150, you have a different amount of responsibility than the senior executive vice president in charge of operations, right? I mean, they're going to have more responsibility to not engage in conflicts of interest, to not engage in waste of company resources, things like that, because they have more control, right, of these sort of things. Whistleblowing becomes an enormously controversial issue in this area, and ethicists have debated. Usually it doesn't work out well for the whistleblower. So what do they say that you have to have if you're going to be an ethical whistleblower? First of all, you have to have a real, not a hypothetical threat. If we think about Enron, when I first started wanting to teach this class, I asked if I could teach this class, and the dean said, you know, our students need substantive skills. They need to understand, you know, things like how to brand something and how to get brand protection through trademark. Why don't you teach a course in that rather than this sort of, you know, very subjective area of ethics? And then we had WorldCom, Enron, and Tyco happen, and AACSB started saying things like, you need to focus in on ethics. And so they said, well, do you know that class you wanted to teach? Well, maybe we're interested in you teaching that class. And one of the reasons that we found out about Enron was because there was a whistleblower who started looking. She was an accountant, and she started seeing that they're engaging in this sort of financial shell game where they are transferring massive amounts of debt to special project entities in order to make sure that the numbers of the primary company, which is Enron, look better than they are. That makes it look more profitable than it is. So that's a real threat as opposed to a hypothetical threat, right? What's a like something that's not necessarily going to happen, that hasn't happened. You know, we're going to bring a drug to market, and we've sort of, you know, engaged in the testing of the drug, and there are, you know, known risks. Every single drug that we bring to market has known risks, right? Which is why if you read the package insert, you wouldn't take any drug. Second, you have to seek to prevent the harm through internal channels. You have to, before you go outside the company and become a whistleblower, you have to seek through internal channels. And then you have to exhaust those channels, right? That's the third requirement, is that you actually go through, you talk to your boss, you go, if they have a policy for you to report ethical violations. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, they're required to have these things like an ethics hotline. You used that methodology before you go outside. Any questions about employee rights and responsibilities? Nope. All right. Well, I am out of, wow, right on time.
Favorite part.
Ran right to 10:45.
We can bring the center. Really like shut
So I'm going to end the stream.
Bill running.